racist murder was committed at a bus stop in Eltham. Stephen Lawrence was cut down in the prime of his life, killed for one reason alone, the colour of his skin. Today, some justice was finally served at the Old Bailey when two men were found guilty of a teenager's murder. Gary Dobson and David Norris both lied through their trial. The jury saw through their lies, and now the killers wait to hear how long they'll spend in prison. Tonight, in a special programme, we'll bring you all the reaction to today's verdicts. But first, Ronkie Phillips reports on the story she has followed since the day Stephen died.
How can I celebrate when my son lies buried? When I cannot see him or speak to him, when will I see, and I'll see him grow up and go to university or get married or have children? These verdicts will not bring my son back.
After 18 long years of bitter disappointment, countless interviews, rallies, marches, appeals for information, raised hopes and crushed dreams, finally there is justice for Stephen. Neville Lawrence's statement was read by his lawyer.
I am therefore full of joy and relief that today, finally, two of my son's killers have been convicted for his murder. They will be sent to prison and forced to face the consequences of their actions. Consequences which my family and I have been living with all these years.
The image of the accused which told the world they thought they'd got away with murder. The original suspects, including David Norris and Gary Dobson, strutting out of the public inquiry. The swagger said they were untouchable. Today's result proved them wrong. But the time and effort it has taken means the Lawrence family has paid a high price.
It's shocking that it's taken 18 years to come to this point, and it's 18 years in which the Lawrences could have dealt with their grief rather than to deal with struggling for justice, and that, I think, is incredibly painful.
In the end, it was this tiny spot of blood which would pave the way for the new prosecution. Discovered by scientists reviewing the case in 2008, it had soaked into the collar of Gary Dobson's jacket. The blood spot had a 1 in a billion chance of not belonging to the dead teenager. The team also found fibres from Dobson's cardigan.
It was a significant finding, and I sort of thorough, methodical working through all the items in the cases. What we're looking for, the significant breakthrough.
Norris was trapped by a 2mm hair from Stephen found on his jeans and other fibres on his sweatshirt. But the defence claimed paper bags used to store exhibits meant the evidence was contaminated.
I'm absolutely confident in the conclusions that I came to, which was that, in my scientific opinion, there was no realistic possibility for the evidence found to have arisen through contamination.
The accused both took the stand, claiming they had alibis and no motive. But the prosecution argued racism was at the heart of the case and showed the jury this secretly filmed video to prove their deep hatred of black people. The video also showed their obsession with knives. Stephen Lawrence and his friend Duwayne Brooks were racially abused and ambushed as they stood at this bus stop. Duwayne got away, but Stephen was swallowed up in the attack, which lasted 20 seconds. He then somehow managed to get to his feet and ran 200 yards before collapsing. Later, the pathologist said he was surprised at how far Stephen had actually managed to run. The teenager had deep, penetrating wounds to the right-hand side of his body and a partially collapsed lung. The pathologist said it was a testament to his sheer physical fitness that he was able to cover the distance he did. Police failures began almost immediately. Several anonymous letters named the suspects, but there were no arrests. The lack of progress led to anger and resentment.
If it had been a white boy, they would have surrounded the black community. They would have arrested as many black boys as they could, and they would not stop until they get the killer.
When lawyers said there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute, the family launched a private prosecution. but the trial collapsed, leaving the suspects to walk free. At the inquest, the 5 suspects refused to answer questions. The inquest jury ruled Stephen had been unlawfully killed in a completely unprovoked racist attack. Days later, a national newspaper printed their photos challenging them to sue. They never did. A lifetime after the aspiring architect was killed, 2 men are beginning sentences for the UK's most notorious race-hate murder. The pain Stephen Lawrence's parents have endured in that time is evident. Their marriage collapsed, and for Doreen Lawrence the suffering will never truly go away. Knowing others who were there on the night her son was killed remain free.
There's probably a bit in the back of her head that thinks, I still want to fight, but I think it's going to be a difficult emotion for her to accept. I hope it allows her to move on, because I think she deserves that.
Ron Phillips, London Tonight, the Old Bailey.
Well, such is the national significance of this case. Within the past hour, the Prime Minister has issued a statement about today's verdict. He said, in the 19 years since his murder, Stephen Lawrence's family has fought tirelessly for justice. Today's verdict cannot ease the pain of losing a son, but for Doreen and Neville Lawrence, I hope that it brings at least some comfort after their years of struggle. That April night in 1993, Stephen was with his friend Duwayne Brooks. He admits he only survived because he was able to run for his life. And just 16 years old at the time, Duwayne says his life ever since has been shaped by the events of that night. In an exclusive interview with our correspondent Simon Harris, he recalls the racist nature of the attack. A word of warning, viewers will be shocked by some of the language their killers used.
Duwayne Brooks didn't need a jury to tell him why his friend was murdered. He knew because he was there. Stephen Lawrence died because he was black. In an exclusive interview, Duwayne recalled how he and his school friend were discussing which bus to catch home.
We were interrupted by a group of white boys on the opposite side of the road who shouted out, "What nigger?" My response was obviously shock, immediate fear. We were in a part of London back then which was dangerous for black people, let alone young black boys by themselves. And there was a gang of 6 white boys on the other side of the road. One began to withdraw a weapon from their trousers. From then, it was, immediate fear, run.
You were running for your lives.
Well, I wish we both had run for our life, to be honest. I wish we both had run. But only I had run, and Stephen had stuck in his position and was attacked by the group of white boys, stabbed and died. All I could think about was why? Why Steve? Never done anything to anybody, no fights, no argument. Yeah, he's been murdered because he's black.
Duwayne Brooks has spent the last 18 years giving his account of what happened in statements, police interviews, court cases and to inquiries. He gave evidence at the Old Bailey as a prosecution witness just hours after his father died. Yet, to begin with, the police doubted his version of events.
The treatment was appalling. For me, it was the constant questions around my integrity and Steve's integrity. There was a disbelief that we were innocent. I was even questioned about the words, what nigger? Senior officers at the station on that night did not believe that was said, and instead were suggesting that it could have been a nickname for Steve that I did not know about. I felt like I was in a battle with the police on that night to convince them that we were innocent, we hadn't done anything wrong.
After giving evidence, Duwayne Brooks flew to Jamaica for his father's funeral, but he returned to London just as the trial was ending.
For me personally, it's part of closure. Can't be full closure because all the suspects are not found guilty. But I'm happy we have a guilty verdict. But I hope more than ever this inspires the investigating team to work harder to bring the rest of the suspects before jury.
What are your thoughts or feelings towards Stephen's killers?
They should be in prison. They should be in prison, and their parents who have given evidence, if they are found to have been lying, should also be sent to prison.
18 years on from the murder of his friend, Duwayne Brooks is a counsellor in Lewisham. He's also a part-time advisor to the police. Today, he says he finds inspiration from fighting injustice. Simon Harris, London Tonight.
The thoughts of Duwayne Brooks there. We'll come to the original police investigation into Stephen's murder in a moment, but first, one of those other men who've yet to face a criminal prosecution over the attack, Jamie Acorte, Neil Acorte and Luke Knight, have always denied being involved, as Glenn Goodman now reports.
In 1999, they sauntered out of the Lawrence inquiry, convinced they'd got away with murder. But now, David Norris and Gary Dobson have finally been convicted. Luke Knight, Neil Acorte and his brother Jamie Acorte were not on trial, but at the inquiry, all 5 men were named as prime suspects. Shortly after Stephen Lawrence was killed, Neil Acorte and Luke Knight were charged with murder, but the charges were dropped due to lack of sufficient evidence. Jamie Acorte has never been charged. As teenagers in Eltham, they were notorious. When the 5 men were interviewed by Martin Bashir on the Tonight programme in 1999, they admitted that they had a reputation.
You've got to understand that every council estate across the length of Britain has got the little who break windows, who play knock down ginger.
And were you part of a group of, as you put it, little on the estate who play knock down?
We've never pretended to be angels. We've never pretended to be anyone else but ourselves.
So were you a group of little on the estate?
Yeah, rascals, lovable rogues.
But their misconduct went a lot further than games of knockdown ginger. Jamie Acorte was suspended from Kidbrooke School after he was found with a monkey wrench in his bag. The following day, he had a fight outside the school with a black pupil. Acorte was armed with a kosh.
I never used the kosh. If anyone saying that I did use it, they're lying, because I never. No one's seen me use the kosh because I never used the kosh. I had the kosh in my hand.
In May 1992, Jamie Acorte, David Norris and Luke Knight were allegedly involved in the assault of 2 brothers, one of whom was said to have been stabbed with a butterfly knife. Charges were brought, but subsequently withdrawn. In November 1992, Gary Dobson allegedly threatened a black teenager with a knife. In March 1993, a white man called Stacey Benfield was stabbed in the chest. He claimed David Norris was the attacker, and Norris was charged with attempted murder. But David's father, Clifford, gave Stacey Benfield £2,000. David Norris was acquitted. His father was later found by police with 2 loaded handguns and an Uzi submachine gun. In the documentary back in 1999, all 5 men protested their innocence and tried to convey an image of reasonable men who've now grown out of their childish, racist behaviour. But just 3 years later, David Norris and Neil Acorte were convicted and jailed for a racist attack on a plainclothes black police officer. And in 2010, Gary Dobson was jailed for drug dealing. For the murder of Stephen Lawrence, 2 men have been convicted. The other 3 suspects have avoided our recent attempts to speak to them.
Are you guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, Mr. Acorte?
They are free, but they continue to live out their lives under a cloud of suspicion. Glenn Goodman, London Tonight.
Well, the Metropolitan Police has also welcomed today's verdicts and paid tribute to the Lawrence family.
We are very pleased for Stephen's family and those who loved him. There have been several investigations over the last 18 years, during which the Lawrence family have campaigned tirelessly for justice. We pay tribute to Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence's courage and dignity. They have contributed to major changes within policing, the law, and indeed within society as a whole.
While 2 men have now been found guilty of Stephen's murder, as we heard, his mother, Doreen Lawrence, is still furious that it took so long to get this far. She will always feel let down by the fact that his killers weren't caught and convicted 18 years ago. The original police investigation in 1993 was found to be flawed. Officers didn't follow obvious leads or arrest suspects. In 1994, the Crown Prosecution Service said they didn't have enough evidence to take the suspects to trial. So the Lawrence family began a private prosecution, but that failed 2 years later. Then, after a highly critical Police Complaints Authority report in 1997, the Home Secretary Jack Straw announced a public inquiry. And 2 years later, the Macpherson report accused the Met of professional incompetence, failure of leadership and institutional racism. It is hard to overplay the impact Sir William Macpherson's report had on the Metropolitan Police Force. For the biggest police force in the country to stand accused of institutional racism was an appalling label that some feel the Met is yet to shrug off. But others believe the Met has made significant strides towards a force that does serve everyone, as Marcus Powell reports.
Changing the image and culture of the Met is a work in progress since the force was condemned for institutional racism 12 years ago. Recruiting more black and ethnic minority officers was vital. In 1999, just 3% of the force were from ethnic minorities. Today, it's nearly 10%. The Met's closer to reflecting the community it serves, but does that ethnic community get the service it deserves?
I think long ago you could identify overt racism in policing. I think it's more about what Sir William identified: unwitting, not thought through, lack of sensitivity, and there are lots of reasons for that, but I think there's good leadership now.
Former Deputy Assistant Commissioner John Grieve pioneered those changes, setting up the first specialist race and violent crimes unit. He reinvestigated the Lawrence murder, but in 1999 his first major success was to take on the unsolved murder of Michael Menson, a talented musician who died after being set on fire in a race attack in North London. Just like Lawrence, previous police investigations had failed to bring Michael Menson's killers to justice, and the Met was condemned for institutional racism. It was only the persistence of Michael's family that forced a re-investigation.
Can I give you this leaflet, in case you hear of anything, big or small, about what happened to my brother in this street outside?
The new race crimes unit quickly made arrests and prosecutions followed here and in northern Cyprus, the team securing convictions of 3 men for murder and manslaughter. Now every part of London has a specialist hate crimes unit. They also have specialist family liaison officers.
What it does do is provide expertise in the investigation of hate crime, and I think in so doing we provide that service to the victims of crime.
There have been huge positive changes, but some believe standards are now slipping.
My fear is that we're going backwards again. I think that the Macpherson report was the high watermark of the police and the authorities' response and sensitivities to police racism and the victims of racism and the victims of poor policing. And I think since then there's been a gradual ebbing away of profile and priority.
Standard! The force has definitely moved on enormously in recent years, but there's always plenty of work left to do.
I'm much more optimistic about where we are today. But having said that...
The thoughts of Trevor Phillips, the chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, concluding Marcus Powell's report there. Well, with me now is Baroness Ros Howells, a tireless campaigner for better race relations here in London. She was with Stephen's parents the night he died. Good evening to you. Thank you for making time for us. First, the obvious question, your reaction to today's verdict.
I believe in the jury system. That's my reaction. I voted for it in the House of Lords, and I believe the jury dealt with the case. There has been no doubt in the community's mind as to who killed Stephen. Getting the evidence was the main obstacle.
We've seen the highly emotionally charged scenes of Doreen Lawrence giving her reaction to the verdicts after the verdicts were given out. A reaction not of relief so much as anger, really, that it took so long.
Doreen has worked tirelessly, but let's remember that Stephen's death was iconic. Stephen was brought up in a family who were the respectable side of Britain, what Britain wanted. A husband, a wife, 3 children, bringing them up. And someone, not a police officer, to knock on your door and tell you that your son has been involved in a racist attack. Young white men in England, in this country where there wasn't apartheid, and killed your son.
How surprised were you then, back in 1993 in Eltham, that such hatred could actually bring about murder?
I worked in community relations. I have no doubt that I was not surprised, but I was stunned that it was Stephen Lawrence, a young man whose family brought him up to respect the law, to be part of the community. These children played tennis. They went to school every day. They had parents who took them to the park. They were the epitome of what British life was supposed to be about. Now, we knew there was racism. There were other people who had been killed. We know how the country never had apartheid, but what it did have was a hatred against black people. And I'm thinking it is the teachings that you inherited from the enslavement of the African peoples.
You used the word earlier, iconic, and part of the iconic nature of this case comes down to the fact that the police investigated it so badly. Institutional racism was the label Sir William Macpherson gave it. How far, finally, do you think that the Met has gone to shrugging off that stain on its reputation?
I think at the time the commissioner who was in charge completely refuted the fact of institutional racism. I believe he didn't understand what we were talking about. It was quite easy to say, oh, there were a few bad eggs in the barrel. But in fact, the conditioning that we receive in this country made us racist, continue to make us racist, and people have not yet learned that you have to unlearn the racism you were conditioned with before you move forward.
Baroness Ros Howells, thank you so much for coming to give us your thoughts. We're grateful. Well, earlier we reported on the overhaul of the Met in light of their original flawed investigation, but changes in the police aren't the only consequences of Stephen's murder. Reaction to his death, the desire to honour the memory of such a promising life cut short, have undeniably been a force for good. Charlene White looks now at Stephen's legacy.
A face that's become a symbol for both struggle and hope. These new photos of the young boy who was denied the chance to grow into a man, but whose image has gone on to define a generation.
We know who the killers are. We have watched them strut before us, as proud as sick Mussolini's.
Benjamin Zephaniah's 1999 poem reopened wounds and debate.
This whole affair inspired a lot of poetry. And now we know that the road to liberty is as long as the road from slavery. It made us as a community look at ourselves as well. One of the unique things about it, it showed you the racism from the police, not just the racist folks on the street, but all these things kind of came together. But at the same time, we were able to look at ourselves and look at our children and just think about some very deep issues.
Our hope is that at the end of the day, we will establish what happened.
The play, The Colour of Justice, based on transcripts of the Macpherson report, captured the growing public anger.
To Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence, these years must have been dreadful.
Compelled by the report's findings, director Nicholas Kent was inspired to honour the family's fight for justice.
I think there's been an absolutely enormous legacy for race relations in this country. The institutional racism as a concept has been introduced into our society. I think a whole step change has taken place. I don't think it's enough. I think we'll all go on.
Women's schools should be changed to reflect society by valuing cultural diversity, a change which is integral to the way that they teach here at St Matthew's Academy.
We use the Stephen Lawrence trial as a reference point, particularly in our citizenship lessons when we look at law and discrimination and racial policy.
The legacy can also be seen elsewhere in paintings such as this, No Woman, No Cry by Chris O'Philly, his tribute to the Lawrence family. So Stephen's imprint has been left in the arts, policing, schools, and led to a national conversation about race and discrimination. But Neville and Doreen have ensured a greater impact here at the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust.
What their heart was to say, is it possible that something good can come from something just immeasurably bad? And so the idea was to see if it was possible, if it were true, in fact, that life could spring from death. And so, of course, Stephen passed away, and his desire was to be an architect. And so although that was taken from him, what the Lawrence family have been able to do is to give it to other Stephens, as we call them.
So the future that Stephen dreamt of can now live on in others.
I think this is what he would wanted us to do, to continue to fight, to instill some of the things that he wanted as far as ambition and drive in kids, and just be an example. I look at my son and I hope that he walks the path and has the same ambitions that Stephen had. Not to be an architect, but just to want to do well, you know, for your family and for yourself.
Elvin Adura ending Charlene White's report on Stephen's legacy. And that is all from London Tonight. On the day, 2 men were convicted of murdering Stephen Lawrence more than 18 years ago. We'll leave the final words of tonight's programme to Stephen's mother, Doreen. Good night.
Now that we have had some sort of justice, I want people to think of Stephen other than a black teenager murdered in a racist attack in southeast London in April 1993. I know this is a fact, but I now want people to remember him as a bright, beautiful young man who any parent of whatever background would have been proud of.